This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Stocks edge higher following dovish Fed minutes and a big downward revision to US payrolls, reinforcing bets on a rate cut next month. Tim Walz has formally accepted the Democratic vice presidential nomination, vowing to cut middle-class taxes and make homes more affordable for Americans. Plus, Israel's Defense Minister says Hamas's Rafah Brigade has been defeated as key mediators cast doubt over ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas. It's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm in Dubai. Lizzie Verdon in for Jemana Versace. Good morning. Welcome to Thursday. It is the day when Jackson Hole kicks off. We're headed towards the highlight of the week, Jay Powell's speech in Wyoming tomorrow. But we got more clues last night as to perhaps where the Fed's rate path is headed in the form of those Fed minutes. It turns out that several members were actually on side for a July cut already, but no real hints here as to whether a half-point move is coming in September. As we look to the futures picture, pointing lower on both sides of the Atlantic currently, the 10-year US Treasury yield about 3.8%, steady there, and Brent even lower today at $76 a barrel as traders continue to monitor the demand story. They continue to watch the progress or lack thereof on ceasefire talks in the Middle East, but they also monitor that weekly stockpile data. So not a lot of oxygen in this crude market. Let's just flip the board because I want to bring you a bit of analysis of that payrolls revision we got yesterday. 818,000, pretty enormous, but very much in line with what economists were expecting. It is a significant revision. There's a bit of a delay. Some of the banks got their hands on this data early, but let's think about the market reaction as well, because after a bit of initial volatility, actually, you saw the confidence from investors recovering a bit. As I say, it's very much in line with what economists expected, but also perhaps a bit of difficulty with the data. It probably excludes a lot of workers like undocumented migrants, so maybe the actual employment numbers are higher. We'll discuss it more in a moment. But just looking at where Fed cuts are at the moment, we've got one priced every Fed meeting for the next 5 meetings. Does this change when we get Jay Powell's speech in Wyoming? But let's go to Avril Hong now. She's in Singapore for us with an update on Asia markets. Avril, what's happening where you are?
Yeah, Lizzie, I think Asia markets are in wait-and-watch mode as we keep an eye out for not just Powell at Jackson Hole, but also Ueda in front of Parliament and, kind of having to defend the hawkish rate hike that we got from the BOJ not so long ago. And in the midst of all that, markets are more or less moving sideways, despite that pretty positive handover from Wall Street. Today, we also got a decision from the BOK. It left things unchanged as expected, and it highlighted debt risks, but it also opened the door for cuts. So that's something that might be prompting this unwind in the initial strength of the Korean won. It's reversing those gains now. The Japanese currency is also more or less moving sideways, hovering at the 145.3 against the greenback, Lizzie.
All right, Avril Hong in Singapore, we thank you. And let's get to the US politics now. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz has formally accepted the nomination to be Kamala Harris's running mate at the Democratic National Convention. He laid out the ticket's economic agenda, saying that Harris seeks to cut middle-class taxes and make homes more affordable for all. So day 3 of the DNC really framed around introducing the former school teacher to a national audience with testimonials from celebrities and students before he took the stage.
If you're a middle-class family or a family trying to get into the middle class, Kamala Harris is going to cut your taxes. If you're getting squeezed by prescription drug prices, Kamala Harris is going to take on Big Pharma. If you're hoping to buy a home, Kamala Harris is going to help make it more affordable.
So let's get more now from Vonnie Quinn, who's joining us from Washington. Vonnie, it seems to be all about the rising stars of the DNC today, not least Tim Walz, the VP pick for Kamala Harris. What do you think has been the message of the day?
It was fascinating. Imagine trying to go on stage after the likes of Stevie Wonder, John Legend, Mindy Kaling, SNL star Kenan Thompson, and of course all of these huge politicians, both from the past like Bill Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, and potentially from the future, Governor Wes Moore of Maryland, for example, Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. Tim Walz then came out and gave a 15-minute speech, Lizzie, maybe one of the shortest speeches from the major keynote speakers of the whole convention so far. He got straight to the point and he went into Coach Walz mode. He gave his biography. He allowed people nationally watching to get to know him a little bit. And then he went into a pep talk. He said that's what he's best at. He said it's the fourth quarter. We're down a field goal, but we're on offense and we've got the ball. And to that point, his former football team had come out on stage right before he took the stage. And it was just a very symbolic moment. That's his wife that you're seeing on screen there, who had also done an ad right before he came out. A very symbolic moment in the sense that he wants to reach rural voters. He wants to reach perhaps the less educated voter, those who've been turned off in recent years by the Democratic Party.
So really introducing himself on a national scale, but interesting that many of his progressive policies, Vonnie, don't actually seem to be going down well at home in his home state of Minnesota.
He has been a very popular governor. Don't forget, it's what Amy Klobuchar called a purple state. But essentially, you know, he's one of the few Democrats to ever have had any success in what was a red district, at least for him. And he served in Congress for 12 years before becoming governor. So he is very much a standout. He's also always pointing out that he's a hunter and, you know, enjoys having guns and using guns. But that after Sandy Hook, he had fought to have red flag laws enacted, for example. So he's a little bit of, you know, a contradiction for a state like Minnesota, and that's what hopefully will help him on the Democratic ticket, at least according to Democrats. But yes, some of his policies were things like free lunches for students, approved paid family leave, medical leave. There was the inaction of a child tax credit, for example. You would think that these would all be very popular, but since they add to a state deficit, then you do have deficit hawks complaining about these kinds of policies.
OK, so the divisiveness may be more, hopefully, for the Democrats, a feature than a bug. Just finally, what else is on the bill today? I know you've got a busy one.
Yes, so later today, obviously, it will be what this has all been building up to. Kamala Harris will formally accept the nomination for presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. But it's hard to know how things can be turned up from here, right? We were already at a fever pitch at the United Center. We had Oprah speaking today, leading the crowd in chants of "We're not going back." We had Bill Clinton today. He had the crowd in tears of laughter at some of his lines, even though it was quite a serious speech. But, you know, he said things like the only vanity he will indulge is the fact that he is still younger than Donald Trump. And then you had Tim Walz making mention of the weird word again, right? He talked about the Donald Trump agenda and he said, is it weird? Absolutely. And that also gave the crowd a huge moment of laughter and levity. So as one person said, who's left to introduce Kamala Harris? I'm not quite sure, but this DNC certainly has programmed this quite well so far. They are looking for that bump, which typically comes after a convention and before what Walz calls the blocking and tackling that they'll have to do, which will come in the next several weeks when they really hit the campaign trail and once this excitement has died down.
All right, Vonnie Quinn, we thank you for the latest on the DNC. But let's not forget the other side. Republican presidential nominee and former President Donald Trump has been criticising the Biden administration over the latest revised payroll numbers. Trump appeared at an outdoor rally for the first time since he survived the assassination attempt last month.
Before we begin, I want to address the massive scandal around the revised job numbers that were just announced this morning. The new data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that the administration padded the numbers with an extra, listen to this one, 818,000 jobs that don't exist.
So I want to discuss those job numbers and more. We can bring in Eric Robertsen for this, Managing Director for Global Head of Research and Chief Strategist at Standard Chartered Bank. Good to have you with me, Eric.
Thanks, Lizzie.
When you think about those payroll revisions, they were what economists were expecting, but do they change your outlook for whether Jay Powell can achieve the soft landing?
No, not really. I think, as you discussed earlier on the show, the revisions were largely in line with expectations. The headline number does look large, but it is consistent with our view that The labor market is certainly softening. We're seeing an increase in the unemployment rate, which we expect to continue. And I think that that does really lay the groundwork for the Fed to start cutting rates in September.
But when you're seeing revisions like this, does it kind of take the edge off the jobs report that so much emphasis had been placed on before the September meeting?
No, I don't think so. Look, one of the things that we do know and that we were never able to put a finger on over the last 6 to 9 months is that there was quite a bit of volatility in the payroll numbers for a variety of reasons, whether it was undocumented migrant workers, etc. I think this gives us a clearer picture that, yes, the labor market has been softening along with the decline in the inflation statistics. And so it does paint a complete picture of a broader economy settling into a softer landing.
And I was talking about the Fed minutes, the desire for a cut already from some members in July. What's your expectation for the rate path for the rest of the year?
Sure. We see 3 25 basis point rate cuts for the balance of 2024. We acknowledge that after the minutes last night, there could be an argument for a 50 basis point rate cut at some point over the next 3 to 6 months. We have a more aggressive rate cutting trajectory for the first half of next year, which probably does imply at least a 50 basis point cut at some point. So I think what it is for the Fed now is a decision about how far they want to push that monetary easing cycle before they have complete certainty.
And we've learned this month that this market is very capable of overreaction.
That's
when
right.
we hear from Jay Powell tomorrow, how does he make sure that he doesn't trigger another one?
I think what the Fed and specifically Powell needs to do this weekend at Jackson Hole is really prepare the markets for the start of the easing cycle, let them know that the Fed will do what is required to support the economy. But I think they will try very hard to manage expectations around fear that this is a hard landing or that the Fed is somehow behind the curve. Because as we all know from previous cycles, if the market starts to get a whiff or a hint that maybe the Fed is starting to get uncomfortable, then you really see the market getting ahead of itself and ahead of the Fed.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if you agree with this take, but you've got an equity market that looks like it's braced for a soft landing and a bond market kind of on tenterhooks for something worse. Do you see the divergence as an issue? Does it suggest that more volatility is coming?
It's certainly consistent with our view that there is a significant divergence across asset classes. You have equities effectively at the highs, equity volatility back where they were pre-volatility shock, rates markets at the lows, and FX volatility still relatively elevated. So the markets are telling you that there is a disconnect. Now, that disconnect is probably the fact that the economy is softening. How much, we're not sure yet. And yet equity markets are at the highs. So the equity markets are clearly saying the Fed is going to come to the rescue. That's the big question mark, and I think that's the uncertainty or the divergence that will need to be resolved at some point.
Which is the thing that Powell perhaps shouldn't be feeding at Jackson Hole.
That's correct.
And because of that hunger for rate cuts, you've seen gold at record highs. I saw a UBS note forecasting it to hit $2,700 an ounce by the middle of next year. Does that sound about right to you?
We do expect gold prices to trend higher. And look, what we have to remember is it's not just the Fed cutting rates. It is global central banks, largely, with a few exceptions, moving into the rate-cutting cycle. And that easier money, or the abandoning of tight money, typically is supportive of gold prices. And if you add volatility into the mix, people will look to that safe haven, and gold is typically that asset.
And in the recent days, I was talking about oil, you've seen it really being weighed on by the demand story, kind of brushing off the tensions here in the Middle East. I wonder whether you think it'll be higher by the end of the year.
So this is a really interesting point. I mean, oil is always in a tug-of-war between sort of geopolitical tensions versus broader macro themes. And for the last, let's call it 4 weeks, it's definitely been macro uncertainty that has pushed oil prices lower. Now, our view is that oil prices at current levels are too low, even if we ignore the geopolitics. The supply-demand factors in the oil industry suggest to us oil should be at a higher price. But we've got U.S. softening, China continues to soften, question marks about Europe's sort of stagnating recovery. All of those macro factors tend to be negative at the margin for oil.
But how do you think about the oil thinking about the geopolitics? Is it that traders are desensitized to what's happening in the Middle East? Is it because they don't think a ceasefire is coming?
There is a bit of numbness to the Middle East politics. And by the way, we saw the same thing with Russia-Ukraine. After the initial anxiety, the markets tend to move on intellectually. I think what we're seeing today is markets have started to believe that we are moving closer to some sort of a ceasefire. And unless we see a complete unraveling in terms of regional politics, they will say, okay, that's going to be less of a driving factor for oil. And so I would say that within kind of a $20 price range for oil, you've probably got a reasonable set of comfort that we're going to find a resolution over the next few months. Now, our geopolitical view is that regional politics are going to remain heavily strained for the next 3 to 6 months, and then we get back to the U.S. election. So.
OK, really interesting. And I'm so pleased that you came to see us in the Dubai studio. Eric Robertsen, Managing Director and Global Head of Research and Chief Strategist at Standard Chartered Bank. Thank you so much for being with me. And we're going to dig deeper into the geopolitics next. Israel saying that Hamas's Rafah Brigade has been defeated. We'll bring you all the latest on whether that ceasefire deal is coming next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Lizzie Burden in Dubai. Now, Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant says that Hamas's Rafah Brigade has been defeated. He added that around 150 tunnels in the area have been destroyed, and it comes with a ceasefire deal looking highly unlikely now after a key mediator, Egypt, reportedly expressed scepticism about the proposal meant to bridge the gaps between Israel and Hamas. Joining me now is Bloomberg's senior editor Bill Ferries in Singapore for analysis. Bill, I have to ask you, is it becoming clear that the US was perhaps projecting more optimism that a deal is close than the reality perhaps warrants? Is there much hope of a deal now, given what we're hearing from both sides?
It does seem like the U.S. heading into Secretary of State Antony Blinken's last trip to Israel, it was his 9th trip since October last year, was probably overly optimistic, perhaps really trying to give some momentum to these peace talks that have seemed to have been at a stalemate for several months now, and largely over the same issues. The U.S. was trying to say that Israel had accepted the proposal, that it was the ball was in Hamas's court to agree to it. Hamas pushing back, saying that the latest deal or latest proposal still has elements that they have been arguing against since the beginning of these talks several months ago. So it does seem to be a stalemate on both sides. Egypt expressing to the Associated Press some of its concerns about whether a deal is really possible. It's quite hard to see what the next steps in this process are.
I feel like every day I ask you when a deal is coming, what the sticking points are, but perhaps it's time to ask you, Bill, what happens if we don't get a deal?
Well, of course, one thing looming over all of this is Iran's response to the killing of two senior leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah. Now, I think it's been more than a month since that occurred. There has been momentum to try to get these peace talks going because of the idea that a peace deal could prevent Iran, at least in the short term, from responding. So that hangs over it. Of course, if you're talking about the hostages, the Israeli hostages still held by Hamas, every day that goes on, every day the conflict continues, increases the likelihood that they could be injured or killed as this war grinds on. We've seen that happening in recent weeks as Israel reclaims the remains of hostages killed in the past few weeks. So those are two key things. And of course, third, it continues the likelihood of the death toll continuing in Gaza, where the health ministry run by Hamas says that more than 40,000 people have been killed so far since this conflict began.
What does the destruction of those 150 tunnels mean for the balance of power in the war?
Well, the destruction of the tunnels is one of the key issues that Israel said it was going into Rafah to deal with. The destruction of the Rafah Brigade is another one of their objectives. Of course, the main objective that Israel has said from the beginning in terms of capturing or killing the senior leadership of Hamas, that's still something they haven't fully managed to do, and it seems to be their motivation for continuing this conflict. But I think Israel will look at this, the destruction of the tunnels, as a reason it needs to keep forces on that southern border with Egypt. It doesn't want to see those tunnels rebuilt if it withdraws, and their withdrawal is one of the key demands of Hamas. So again, that gets back to the stalemate we've had for several months now, and it's hard to see either side compromising on those demands.
OK, Bloomberg senior editor Bill Ferries, we thank you for that update. Now, to a developing story in Europe. Italian divers have retrieved 5 bodies from a luxury yacht that sank in a storm off Sicily. The British tech entrepreneur Mike Lynch and Morgan Stanley International Chairman Jonathan Bloomer are among those feared dead after Monday's disaster. Italian prosecutors are investigating how the 56-metre Bayesian, which was built to withstand hurricanes, sank off Sicily within minutes. Witnesses say they were shocked at how quickly it disappeared. We'll keep across that story, but plenty more coming up for us here on Horizons Middle East and Africa, so do stay right with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Lizzie Burden in Dubai. To some of our top corporate stories now. Ford says it's making further cutbacks to its electric vehicle strategy, cancelling plans for a fully electric sport utility vehicle. The shift may cost the car maker nearly $2 billion. Ford's also further delaying a next-generation electric pickup and cutting spending on EVs to 30% from 40% of its annual capex. Elsewhere, Paramount shares rose after the bell, with a source telling Bloomberg that Edgar Bronfman Jr. is raising his takeover bid to $6 billion. Earlier this week, he made a $4.3 billion offer for control of the entertainment conglomerate. Paramount had already accepted an offer from Skydance, but has now extended by 15 days a deadline to consider other offers. And in other news, former Morgan Stanley CEO James Gorman will lead a committee searching for a successor to the Disney CEO Bob Iger. Gorman joined the entertainment giant's board this year, and Disney notes that he also oversaw succession at Morgan Stanley. Disney is weighing both internal and external candidates to succeed Iger, whose second term as CEO runs through 2026. Those are some of our top corporate stories, but coming up on the programme, we're going to talk geopolitics as the election battle in the US heats up. Analysis of the foreign policy outlook with the Royal United Services Institute coming up next. You're currently looking at futures pointing lower stateside, as they are in Europe, but we'll bring you a full market check next. So do stay with us. This is Bloomberg. This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Stocks edge higher following dovish Fed minutes and a big downward revision of US payrolls, reinforcing bets of a rate cut next month. Tim Walz has formally accepted the Democratic vice presidential nomination, vowing to cut middle-class taxes and make homes more affordable for Americans. And Israel's Defense Minister says Hamas's Rafah Brigade has been defeated as key mediators cast doubt over ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Lizzie Burden in Dubai, in for Jemana Basecci. Good morning, welcome to Thursday. And today is the day that Jackson Hole kicks off. We're going to have full coverage for you right here on Bloomberg TV. Of course, the highlight being Jerome Powell's speech tomorrow. But we got more clues on what the Fed is thinking last night. Of course, we got those Fed minutes for July. Interesting to see that a few members actually were keen to cut already in July. But but no real clues that a half-point cut is coming in September. So we're looking at the current futures picture pointing lower on both sides of the Atlantic, 0.1% lower for S&P futures and Euro Stoxx 50 futures. The 10-year US Treasury yield steady about 3.8%, and Brent right down to $75 a barrel here as the concerns about demand continue to outweigh the geopolitical tensions that we've just been discussing in the Middle East, and as those stockpile data are monitored by traders as well. But we had those payroll revisions last night, so let's dig a little deeper into what we saw. You can see this downward revision to 818,000. Pretty phenomenal, actually, but very much in line with what economists expected. Hence, investors regained their confidence pretty quickly after this data dropped, even if it is the biggest revision in 15 years. Now, if we flip the board over to the next chart, you can see that we've got the Fed pricing as it stands here. Meetings every way to the end of the year, all 5 of them seeing a cut from traders. But does that picture change as we hear from Powell tomorrow? We'll keep across it for you. But let's go over to Avril Hong now. She's in Singapore with an update on Asia markets. Avril.
Yeah, Lizzie, investors in this part of the world also going to be keeping an eye on Powell, but also Ueda. And ahead of all that, we're seeing stocks, the benchmarks in the region are pretty flat in terms of dollar yen. We're also not seeing that much of a move, but you get the sense that traders are bracing for what's to come tomorrow. A measure of expected overnight volatility is jumping to its highest level in 2 weeks. Why 2 weeks? That was when we saw the market chaos. So certainly this is something they're keeping a really close eye on. Flip the board, because the other thing that we are watching, of course, is what we got from an official from a Chinese regulatory body. And the sense you get based on the local media reports is that they are not trying to control the yields. This is more about the financial stability. They don't want banks to kind of take on the risk onto their balance sheet. So this is something that seems to be emboldening the Chinese bond bulls, as if they needed any help with that. But bonds are climbing again in China. Lizzie.
Avril Hong, we thank you for the update. Now, let's get back to the US politics. We'll head back to Chicago. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz taking centre stage at the Democratic Convention as he formally accepted the nomination as Kamala Harris's running mate. Following testimonials from celebrities, Democratic leaders and former students to introduce Walz to a national audience, he laid out the ticket's economic agenda.
If you're a middle-class family or a family trying to get into the middle class, Kamala Harris is going to cut your taxes. If you're getting squeezed by prescription drug prices, Kamala Harris is going to take on Big Pharma. If you're hoping to buy a home, Kamala Harris is going to help make it more affordable.
So let's bring in Mitchell Reiss, Distinguished Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and former US Special Envoy for Northern Ireland. So good to have you with me, Ambassador. Thank you for making the time. I want to start by asking you, Kamala Harris is outpolling Donald Trump, but can she beat him? That's what really matters.
Well, she absolutely can beat him, but we have to remember it's very early days. We haven't even had Labor Day yet. It's the summer. A lot of Americans aren't really paying attention closely to the politics, but the polling has to be encouraging for the vice president, along with all the money she's been raising. She's been out fundraising Donald Trump, which is no small thing. So she's had a very good few weeks.
And if she wins, do you expect much difference between her foreign policy and President Biden's?
Well, there always is a transition when there's a new president, and it's a mistake, I think, to think it's going to be simply more of the same with Biden, Biden's foreign policy. There will be a lot of continuity, I think, with a lot of the people wanting to stay on. Probably the senior positions will change. But the reality is we don't really know very much about her foreign policy priorities, about her preferences, about her instincts in a crisis. And that's something that I'm sure the American people are going to want to know, and the Trump administration, the Trump campaign is going to ask about over the next 70 days or so.
Well, as I say, you were President George W. Bush's special envoy for the Northern Ireland peace process. I wonder, whoever is the next occupant of the White House, what lessons they should draw from that peace process for the peace process in the Middle East now?
Well, I think we're seeing some of those lessons actually being applied. The United States has an essential role to play whenever there's a conflict around the world. We have the most power economically, militarily. We also have convening power. We can bring parties together in ways that other countries really can't. And so we've seen that from Secretary of State Blinken and other officials over the last few months, with really an extraordinary amount of time invested in trying to bring a ceasefire to the conflict in Gaza. So there are lessons to be heard, and one of them is that you need to engage with people who, morally it may be very difficult for you to admit you want to sit down with. These are people who have blood on your hands. But as an Israeli prime minister once said, you make peace with your enemies, not with your friends. And so we're seeing that right now in the Middle East.
But Secretary of State Blinken has been to the Middle East 9 times, and again he's left empty-handed. I wonder whether the failure to reach a ceasefire deal is really the result of American failure to put enough pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu.
Well, right now, the media is reporting that it's Hamas that has not responded for more than 4 days to the latest proposal. So it's easy to blame one side in these negotiations. We don't really have access to all the details. We don't know who is being more recalcitrant than the other. We don't know who's being more reasonable than the other. But this is a normal process for a peace process. It never happens as quickly as you'd like. It is frustratingly slow. You have to try and fail until you succeed. And I think everybody is wishing the Secretary of State the best of luck in his efforts.
I also just want to touch on Ukraine, because given the prospect of stalemate there, I wonder whether the US and Ukraine's other allies, of course, should be doing more to help President Zelensky's advance into the Kursk region of Russia.
Well, this is a really complicated question, and there's a wide spectrum of differences in the United States, not just between the parties, but within the parties, as to how aggressive the United States ought to be helping the Ukrainians. The Biden administration has been overly cautious in the view of some Republicans, but some Republicans are isolationist and don't think the United States ought to be helping the Ukrainians at all. So what's happened recently, I think, has been a remarkable tactical surprise for the Russians. I think it's bolstered the morale of the Ukrainians. It's also validated the support that the Europeans and the United States have given the Ukrainians. Is it going to be part of an end game? Should ceasefire talks actually start to really ramp up? That's the question. A lot of it's going to depend on whether Ukrainians can hold on to this territory or whether this is just a tactical effort that isn't going to have much long-term significance when the two parties sit down to negotiate an end to this war, which they will. Every war must end. This one will too. The United States, I think, has a big stake in how it ends and what a future pathway for a democratic Ukraine is coming out of it.
Well, again, you have been closely involved in negotiating a peace process. Does the incursion change when or if Ukraine should come to the negotiating table?
Well, I think it does. I think it's a huge embarrassment for Putin. As I said, I think it boosts Ukraine's morale. This war is taking a huge toll on Russia. The more pain that can be inflicted on the economy in particular, the more it's clear that it can't be won. That is really what's needed for Russia to come to the negotiating table. And there has to be a formal process. In every negotiation, that's step number one. You have to create a negotiating process. And then there has to be significant overlap in the interests of the two sides. Not identical, it never is. But both parties need to be able to reach some compromise, far less than their ultimate goals. And that's really the art and the science of negotiating. And the U.S., I believe, has an essential role to play in bringing these two parties together and ending this terrible war.
Okay. Ambassador, thank you so much for getting up early for us. I know you're not far from my hometown there. Mitchell Reiss, Distinguished Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and former US Special Envoy for Northern Ireland. Your expertise always appreciated on the programme. Now, let's go to the EU-China subsidy war. China launching an anti-subsidy investigation into dairy imports from the EU. It's the latest development in this tit-for-tat trade dispute, and Bloomberg's China correspondent Min Lo has been all across it. She joins us now from Hong Kong. Min, why do you think the Chinese government's going so hard after the dairy sector?
Hey, Lizzie. It's not quite surprising given that the European dairy sector benefits immensely from government subsidies. If you look at the EU's largest subsidy program, that's the CAP program, the Common Agricultural Policy, which has a budget of 60 billion euros a year, which makes up more than a third of the EU's expenditure. So that's where China can make a strong case that the European producers are benefiting unfairly from these state subsidies. And if you look at the overall trade balance between EU and China as well, and you look at the categories where the EU runs a trade surplus with China, top of that list is food and drinks, followed by raw materials. So if you trace back to the start of when the EU had begun investigating Chinese EVs, so far Beijing has responded with probes into EU pork, EU brandy, and now cheese, dairy products. So it's all about food and drinks that they can hit the EU with. But if you look at the overall trade balance, again, that's overwhelmingly in China's favor, which means that any sort of tit-for-tat retaliation when it comes to these tariffs is likely going to inflict more pain on the Chinese side than the EU side. The Commerce Ministry is investigating 20 subsidy programs that covers the European dairy industry. It's a $1.9 billion trade. At least last year, it was $1.9 billion, less than 1% of the overall EU-China trade.
Well, as you say, this is a two-way street. Let's think about the tariffs the other way, because you've got Geely Auto, one of the Chinese EV companies that actually cooperated with the EU probe there, and they're now saying that the extra levies will be a big hit to exports.
Yes, that's right. So they're one of the companies that are warning about the big impact that these tariffs will have, even though they're actually in very good standing. If you look at their earnings, it was very good in the first half of the year. It was up 575% in the first half, but that's granted as because of a one-off gain, partly from a deemed disposal of subsidiaries. But at the same time, if you look at the revenue, it's up 47% in the first half. Vehicle deliveries was up 41%, and they have now increased their sales target this year from 1.9 million cars to 2 million cars. But then if you look at one of their sister companies, Polestar, which is an EV company that exports to the EU, its exports in July was down 42%. So there you go. You already see the impact of these tariffs on their sales there. But Geely's, its company's executives have come out to say that they will be able to respond flexibly to these EU tariffs because its parent company also controls the Swedish brand Volvo, the British brand as well, and a London electric company. So it does have some R&D centers and plants in Europe from its parent company, and it will be able to tap on these production facilities to help it kind of stay resilient amid this tariff war.
Crucial context. Bloomberg's China correspondent Min Lo, thank you as always. Coming up, scientists in Central Africa are investigating the spreading Mpox virus, and they discover complex infection patterns. We'll get you the latest next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Lizzie Burden in Dubai, 8:47 a.m. here. And let's go to Africa now, Central Africa, where disease detectives are working to slow the spreading Mpox virus and finding a complex mosaic of infection patterns involving different viral strains and infection routes. Bloomberg's Chief Africa correspondent Jennifer Sadger joins me now for more. And Jen, what do we know about these various infection patterns?
Right. Lizzie, this is changing quite quickly, and we're actually hearing from experts that the way of transmission is really changing depending on where you look at it. And the expectation is that we will potentially see more sporadic imported cases like what we potentially have seen this week in Thailand and also potentially in Argentina happening. But if we take a look specifically at what's happening in the DRC, we've seen transmission mostly be among adults through sexual contact. There's also been transmission through physical contact, but it's important to note that there are different strains that are being transmitted throughout different communities. And depending on which strain you're talking about, it affects people differently. There was concern when this first became a global health emergency last week about its effect on children. And what we know right now is that at least in Congo, about 80% of child cases is said to be this subvariant of the clade 1A, which is not expected to be deadly. But the concern, though, is really that this is spreading fast and it's changing and becoming more aggressive as we see more and more mutated strains. And so that's why experts are really honing in on the fact that we need to educate people about different behavior patterns that might need to change, but also testing to ensure that we know what exactly the strain is that is being transmitted in the different communities.
Yeah, what are the suggestions from public health officials? How concerned are they?
You know, I think it depends on where you look. They're really, you know, what we heard on Wednesday is a lot of experts talking about the education aspect of it. They did say, you know, we heard from the WHO saying that, no, this is not the new COVID. But when we talk about transmission patterns and just how aggressive these strains are, they're saying it's similar to what we have seen with Ebola and with COVID. But again, it is important to note that testing, it needs to be a part of this whole entire equation. And especially when we think about testing in Africa, because this is where a lot of the we're seeing a lot of these subvariants, and potentially then we're seeing it being exported elsewhere. But we're also seeing testing and a lot of manufacturers wanting to step up their own testing in different parts of the world, just again to understand what exactly the mutated strains are and how they're behaving differently in different patients.
And Bavarian Nordic is, of course, the maker of one of the only approved vaccines, and it reports earnings today, Jen. Did we get any guidance from them about how Mpox is going to affect their business?
Right. So what's been interesting is Bavarian Nordic is, as you mentioned, one of the only makers of the Mpox vaccine. They also have this smallpox vaccine. And ahead of the earnings that we get later today, we did hear that they expect to meet their full year target just because of a lot of what we're seeing right now. We've seen shares for Bavarian Nordic already climb more than 30% since the start of this month. And what they told us on Wednesday is that because they attained this contract with an undisclosed European company for doses, they will attain this top-year target. What will be interesting to note is what the CEO says. He'll be on the show later this morning.
All right, we'll keep an eye for that interview. Jennifer Savassajawi, thanks for the update. And we'll have you plenty more ahead on Horizons Middle East and Africa, so do stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Lizzie Burden in Dubai. Now, Xiaomi shares are in the focus today after the company reported its fastest pace of revenue growth since 2021. That's thanks to a recovery in the smartphone market and the initial success of its first electric vehicles. The Vice President and CFO, Alan Lamb, told Bloomberg exclusively about his company's EV growth strategy.
Initially, when we started this business, obviously, the market has grown to be much more competitive since we started this business back in 2021. This is the first year we start delivering our cars, and our initial expectations was not as high. We were expecting around 70 to 80,000 delivery for the entire 2024. But as you can see from our call last night, we've been talking about 100,000 to 120,000 units for this year, right? And obviously, EV is still very much a scale business. If you have a bigger scale, you can amortize your fixed costs more efficiently, number one. So once you have now that we have a bigger delivering target for this year.
What is that, sorry?
The new delivery target?
100,000 to 120,000.
Okay.
So, so that allows us to amortize our fixed costs more efficiently, number one. Number two is, and we mentioned that in our call last night as well, is the suppliers have been really, really good to us. They were able to work with us and offer us the best prices that is available in the market, despite our scale was not as big as many of our peers. So that also helped us in terms of lowering our BOM cost. I think number three is also that when you look at our EV, you can see that we offered a lot of different fun stuff, right? We have different colors, we have different accessories that you can buy, and that obviously help us enhance our margins overall.
When you talk about scaling the EV business, obviously it means a greater investment as well in factories or production facilities. Where are you looking to build those?
Well, I think we started our factory, our first factory in Beijing right now. That has an annual capacity of, call it, 200,000 units. We obviously trying to scale that up and become more efficient. So if you look at our plans, we started double shift beginning of June, and then we have to make some changes to our productions during the course of July that help us enhance the production capacity further. So if you look at our delivery right now, we are over 10,000 vehicles that we delivered per month in June and in July, most likely in August as well. So we've been able to scale our production facility as well as our delivery capabilities.
So that was the Xiaomi Vice President and CFO Alan Lamb speaking exclusively with our tech reporter Annabelle Drulers. That does it for Horizons Middle East and Africa. I've been Lizzie Burden in Dubai. Stay with me. Daybreak Europe is coming up next as we look at futures pointing lower. This is Bloomberg.